Let's get some analysis now from former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, author of the new book, Understanding Trump. He joins us from Arlington, Virginia tonight. Mr. Speaker, thanks for being here.
Oh, Brett, it's good to be with you.
Listen, you've been through a number of these battles, these fiscal cliffs in your time. How do you look at this about, one, getting tax reform across the finish line, whether Republicans can do that, and two, dealing with all of the loose ends on funding the government?
Well, they'll both be a little bit of a mess. The tax bill will be less of a mess. I think they're very close to working out a deal. I think they probably will meet the president's goal of getting it on his desk the week of the 18th. I think that's very good for the American economy. We're already up above 3% real growth. I think with this tax bill coming into effect next year, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see us get to 4%, which means more jobs, more take-home pay. Really a good news for the Republicans going into the election. I think on the end of the year process, a 2-week clean continuing resolution, if the Democrats will agree to it in the Senate. I agree that Senator or Speaker Ryan, he can pass it in the House. If they can get an agreement to do that in the Senate, then you're going to have, as soon as the tax bill's over, you're going to have about a week of really hard-nosed negotiating. They're going to have to get some Democratic votes. I suspect it'll leave some Republicans unhappy. But in the end, I think no one has an interest in closing the government, and so I suspect they will finally, around the 22nd, 23rd, 24th. I once was here at Christmas Eve, still voting, so I wouldn't be shocked if it took them that long, but I think they'll get it done.
Yeah, Obamacare was Christmas Eve as well on the Senate side. Let me ask you about where Democrats are, because there's some criticism that they say the Republican Party of old is now hypocritical. Here is Congressman Maloney today.
New rule. After today, the Republican Party can choose to support massive new debts, and it can support politicians who abuse kids, but it cannot lecture the rest of us about it. The rest of us have listened to our last lecture from Republicans about family values or fiscal discipline. From now on, that party has no credibility on either issue.
Speaker Gingrich.
Well, first of all, without getting off on all sorts of innuendo, I would say the news of the last couple of weeks, the Democrats aren't in much position to lecture anybody about personal behavior. But in terms of long-term growth, look, Ronald Reagan convinced the Republican Party, along with Jack Kemp, back in the late 1970s, that economic growth, a bigger economy, more revenue, was the key to the future. And Reagan launched what was almost 20 years of economic growth. People had more take-home pay. They had a better future. As the president said in an earlier segment that you had, Brett, when people get to choose between 4, 5, or 6 jobs, they're a lot happier than if there's only one job or no job available. So the Republican gamble is very straightforward. If you stimulate the economy, if you encourage small business, if you give tax cuts to the middle class, can you get so much economic growth that you begin to move America back on a track where the sheer size of the revenue stream begins to pay down the debt? We did it in the 90s. I'm the only speaker in modern history to author 4 straight balanced budgets. We know it can work because it did work. I think Paul Ryan has the same goal, and I think that President Trump has that goal. It'll take 5 or 6 years. But if this economy starts to roar, you're going to see a flood of money come in, and you're going to see, because the economy's bigger, not because we raised taxes, but because we created jobs.
Let me ask you about this investigation and where you see it, the Mueller investigation, what we're learning about his team, past and present, and where it is going.
This is a level of corruption and dishonesty beyond anything I would have expected a year ago. You take everything that happened with Hillary Clinton, the fact that they deliberately interviewed her without putting her under oath, and you take everything she did, and it's General Flynn, who served his country in uniform for 35 years, who's guilty. He's guilty of what? Apparently of not being totally accurate in describing an interview which probably the FBI actually had a tape of. Talk about a setup. I think that Michael Ledeen wrote an article today that was exactly right. Flynn was faced with bankruptcy. He was faced with a threat legally to his son. He cut a deal to get it over with. I think it is a sad day for America when the Federal Bureau of Investigation allows itself to be this corrupt. I cannot imagine that any American believes that if the same standard had been applied to Hillary Clinton, that she wouldn't have been found guilty over and over and over. But it wasn't the same standard, and we now know why. You have members of the FBI who are actively anti-Trump, actively pro-Hillary.
I want to just play one quick soundbite. A lot of the focus has been on this Logan Act and about the incoming administration and the Trump team in transition reaching out to foreign governments. This is a soundbite from Mark Toner, the spokesperson from the State Department, 7 days before the inauguration of President Trump, being asked about all of this.
This building doesn't see anything necessarily inappropriate about contact between members of the incoming administration and foreign officials, no matter what country they're from.
No.
Right?
No. And again, this has been ongoing. I mean, we stand ready if they want to work through the State Department to contact some of these individuals.
There seems to be a disconnect here.
Brett, listen, you'd have no reason to know this, but I actually used the Logan Act in the 1980s. The Logan Act was written in 1798 in order to stop American citizens from negotiating against their own government. But Flynn was the nominated national security advisor of a newly elected president. He was not approaching the Russians as a private citizen. He was approaching the Russians at the direction of the president-elect in his role as a member of a government transition team. So the Logan Act would never apply to Flynn. And it's an absurdity to suggest that it would. That's why these things, and I warned about this months ago, this is what happened to a very, very good friend of mine, Scooter Libby, who worked for Dick Cheney. If the FBI wants to get you, they take something, in this case, they probably had a tape because they had been following the Russian ambassador. They know exactly what was said. You deviate one word, and suddenly it's your fault. The fact is, Karl Rove wrote a column in which he said he almost got indicted for, quote, not remembering. Now, that's how sick it gets.
Speaker, I got to leave it there.
We're watching one. Okay, thank you.
Well, we're hitting a hard break here, but we really appreciate your time and your assessment as always.